Hello and welcome to my next Then and Now instalment about my books, and today we're going to Hong Kong. I first went to Hong Kong in 1986. I had a travelling scholarship for an American university I was teaching at, and it meant travelling around China and Tibet. But I flew into Hong Kong to first of all, because that was the main entry point to China, even though it wasn't officially in China. And I'll never forget arriving in Hong Kong. In those days, you flew into an airport called Kai Tak, which was just a runway that stuck out into the Victoria Harbour, and to fly there you had to fly between blocks of flats and things, and then at the last minute the pilot tipped the plane, is a 747, and tipped it and went into land, so you could see the washing on either side. It was quite a terrifying but exciting experience. And then as you landed on this short runway, they had to pull up pretty quickly, otherwise you'd end up in the drink. But apart from the excitement of that, the most exciting thing for me, even more so, was when the plane turned round and we got off and we went down the gangplank. In those days you didn't have any steps, you didn't have any of those sort of jetway things. And there before me was central Hong Kong. And how can I describe it? To see all those skyscrapers, the water there. The only way to say that it was a Manhattan with mountains, and I think it was the most exciting cityscape I've ever seen. Well, since then, I think it's the most extraordinary cityscape in the world. And but it didn't start out like that, and it started out back in the early 1840s when Britain seized it as part of reparations because the Chinese had sunk some British ships which were peddling opium into Canton, and so we sent gunboats up the various rivers and into China, and they had to concede, and basically we bullied ourselves back into China, and part of the reparations was the island of Hong Kong, which was ceded to Britain in perpetuity. But before then it was just a sort of a rocky island at the mouth of the Pearl River, and it was mainly a fishing island, and it got the name Hong Kong because somebody, one of the Chinese living there, described it as, certainly it was that, and which stood for fragrant harbour. But this is what it actually looked like, and it's the earliest known photograph I found for my Then and Now book of Hong Kong just as the British arrived and before they started to build anything. There you are, you see. Just nothing there, really. There's just the Lion Rock in the front. I found that photograph. I'm very proud to have found it, actually. But, of course, over time, it went from that rock, to this. That's the front cover. To this. And I suppose the thing about trying to do a Then and Now in Hong Kong is challenging because it is changing all the time. It's a very exciting city, and it's difficult to sort of keep track of what you want to get done, you know, because the buildings, you can research it and get there and find that the building that you wanted to photograph had already been knocked down in the time you researched it and got out there. And these things were happening all the time. But there are many parts of Hong Kong that, like with Singapore, that are retained, and it's also got the advantage of this fantastic, absolutely staggering landscape and seascape, and of course the mountainscape. But here we are in Hong Kong when the British actually took possession, and in fact a place called Possession Street is still there, but there they are. I couldn't find a photo. There's a drawing of the British seizing Hong Kong, and it's being signed over to them. And but Hong Kong itself, being mountainous, there wasn't any room to build, so there you've got, researched this, all those red lines show how the harbour itself has been reclaimed. There's more and more infill into the Victoria Harbour. So the first down here is where the Possession Street was, where the original shoreline was, and it's been moved out and out and out with infill. And most of the Hong Kong we know is built on this bit, which is a rather odd thought, isn't it? That it's a sort of we've actually constructed the whole thing out of nothing. And here is another picture of the sort of thing in the centre when it was built. There's in the mid 19th century, which 1863, you see the grandeur of Hong Kong when it was built there. But then here in the same place we've got this. You can see there's a tram running where the water used to be, and that's quite normal. That's the sort of look you had. I photographed that from that to that. It's a funny how Hong Kong really, developed really, because it was something of a backwater in the British Empire, and it guarded the Pearl River, so we could carry on doing our opium business, and so they guarded the business, and they made a lot of money. But it wasn't considered to be. It wasn't in the sort of the public consciousness in the way of some other places in the British Empire were. But probably one of the most famous places that we know about in terms of music from there, in the general sense, is of course something like this. Oh ho ho ho, oh ho ho ho, ho ho ho. Everybody was kung fu fighting. Those cats were fast as lightning. In fact, it was a little bit frightening, but they fought with expert timing. Kung fu fighting, kung fu fighting, kung fu fighting, expert timing. Well, kung fu fighting was something that came in the early 70s when popular songs in Hong Kong became universal, and popular films, of course, mainly made by Bruce Lee. And in fact, I found a statue of Bruce Lee that had been erected on the waterfront in Hong Kong. There's the waterfront, but here is Bruce Lee, the original kung fu guy. But it's interesting that that song wasn't from his films, of course, but it made the name kung fu very famous, and it was actually sung by somebody called Carl Douglas, who was actually from Jamaica. And it shows this sort of crossover culture, and he used to come on and sing this. You saw him on Top of the Pops and things, dressed up in Chinese garb, and sing it. But as I say, the main business of Hong Kong was always making money to do with that. I mean, the opium trade was to do with that, and making the kung fu films was to do with making money. And one of the major drivers of that were big companies like Jardine Matheson, who are still in existence, Dents and Company, who no longer exist, and perhaps the most famous one in terms of banks, HSBC, which a lot of people don't know stands for Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation, because that's where they were headquartered. In those days, Hong Kong was one word. That's why it's HSBC rather than HCSBC, HKSBC. But it shows how rich the banks were. I mean, if I took a photograph of a then and now of the Hong Kong Bank, we'll have a look at that one, and you'll see what I mean. Here, their present headquarters is a huge one by Foster's. There it is, in the centre of Hong Kong, the architects. But when you look back at what they used to have, I mean, here at the bottom here, in 19th century, they had this, that great place. Then, not long afterwards, they went and knocked that down and built a sort of classical one in the same place. And then they went and built this in the 30s in the same place. This bloody great thing. There. Then that was went, and now we've got this. This is almost as though they don't know what to do with the money. Hong Kong is divided socially, but it's the only place I know where the social divide is actually to do with the altitude. I mean, there must be other places, but basically the higher up you go, the posher you are. So that mountain behind the peak, if you're going up in the world, you are literally going up in the world to buy a place further up the peak, where the British settled, the British colonial administrators. Posh Peak they called it, and the Chinese Hong Kongers weren't allowed up the peak until the 1930s or so, unless they were working as cleaners and things like that. But they weren't allowed to wander around on the roads of the peak, and they were very sort of snobby about that thing. And there was a funicular railway up to the peak, in which there were different classes of people. The first class, of course, the governor and the grand sort of generals and this sort of thing, officers of certain description, and it went right down to the third class. But the funny thing was the governor's dogs had to travel in the third class compartment along with the riffraff, you see. I don't know what the dogs thought of that. But as I say, it was a backwater of empire until 1949, and what happened there was that in 1949 the communist takeover of China became communist China, and what happened was that a lot of most of the businesses, it's called, like I said, Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation, HSBC, well, most business, far more than in Hong Kong, was in Shanghai. It's another book I'll talk about later in the series. And in Shanghai, all the business people, Chinese, British, Americans, everybody, decamped very quickly indeed in 1949. And where did they head? Well, they nearly all headed for Hong Kong. So today you can see that most of the people who were the rich in Hong Kong, who ran the major businesses, could trace their history back to Shanghai. Many of them were Shanghainese. And it was from that time that Hong Kong took over from Shanghai as the major entrepot onto the west from the east. And of course Shanghai didn't start to recover until about 30 years ago, but I'll come back to that later. But the image of Hong Kong was somehow considered to be, and Shanghai of course, there's somehow sleazy and exciting place to be, and but it's only brought to public attention in terms of entertainment in about 1960 with a film called The World of Suzy Wong, and it was had Nancy Kwan in it, who's Chinese and Hong Kong Chinese, and William Holden, and they played parts of he played the part of I think he got a job in a bank or some posh place, but he's also a painter, so he went to do painting, and he met Suzy Wong, and because he saw across a bar and he wanted to paint her sitting on a stool in a sort of coquettish manner, And of course, when she came into his studio, she said, "Where do you want me to take my clothes off?" And he said, "No, I just want to paint you fully clothed." And he couldn't understand this because Suzy, of course, was a prostitute. And this was considered sort of a bit racy in 1960. But of course, looking back on the film and that sort of time, that change for Hong Kong when it was brought to public attention as entertainment for the world, before Bruce Lee and that sort of thing, when you look back at it from today's standards, you could see, well, I could see, and I'm sure you could, that Suzy Wong, who was a prostitute, the Chinese girl, represented China, which had been raped and been prostituted since 1849, and of course he was the Westerner who had come in and was there to somehow rescue in some way. Of course, it's as you can imagine, they fell in love, and the rest is history, as they say. But it was an interesting film for that part, because it sort of was that cusp of when Hong Kong became sort of public property in a way, and became something to do in the public imagination about what it was, not just a sort of an outpost of the British Empire. And there was another tune that I liked very much, which I played right at the beginning, and it was called the Hong Kong Beat, and that was for a series on television 30-40 years ago now, about the Royal Hong Kong Police, and it was very exciting film, but it had that rather haunting music. Today, Hong Kong's has the third largest stock exchange in the world, and it's more or less on the par with New York and London. The Hang Seng, of course, is based there, and it is still a preeminent financial centre, world centre, and it is very much a world city, and you feel it like that when you're there, that it's an international city par excellence. It's more than Sydney or anything like that. You feel as though you are, as you do in London and you do in New York, that you are more or less in the centre of the world. And Hong Kong, after independence, well, not independence from Britain, we'll come back to that, relaunched itself as Asia's world city. But the fear of the communist takeover was absolutely palpable, and I even felt it in 1986 when I went there, and I had people coming up to me in Hong Kong in 1986 and saying, is there any way that they knew of somebody whereby they could get a visa or a passport to escape to Britain or America or anywhere really? And New Zealand saw me as a Westerner, Chinese, Hong Kong people who wanted to get out and weren't given the opportunity to get out. Well, what the British did later was they introduced, which they never had there, they introduced suffrage, universal suffrage, whereby each Hong Konger had a vote. Which was extraordinary, really. Not long before the Chinese seized Hong Kong back, which we had to give it back because, as a general said to Mrs. Thatcher at the time, she says, "Well, why can't we hold on to Hong Kong? The lease on the main island hasn't run out; that's in perpetuity, and it's just the new territories we've got to give back." And he said, "Well, look, put it this way, Prime Minister: the Chinese have more bullets. The Chinese have more soldiers than we have bullets." And she says, "Oh, I see." But so the fear of the takeover was there, and of course it was inevitable that eventually they should. And now you've got a situation where it's rather late in the day suffrage it is now being taken as a beacon to say, well, the Chinese are trying to introduce the one-party state and lack of suffrage in the sense that we have it in the West in democracy. And of course, from a Chinese perspective, two things, and I don't speak for them, but knowing a little bit about China, I could see, first of all, on this one, they would say, well, you had it for nearly 200 years, or nearly 250 years, without any human suffrage at all. You just it was just run by the governor reporting to London, which was true. And you only introduced that just before we took over and got it back. And the other is, of course, the general humiliation of where China itself had been treated like a prostitute and just split up from 1845 onwards, right up to 1949, when the communists took over. So it's a difficult one, really, to say, for us to stand up and say that we are in the right, really. And I think that people say, I mean, one of the main fears of the Hong Kong was that it was going to be not just a one-party state to be run by, even though the 50-year agreement would have been reached, but that its business would disappear. It would become like another communist city. But of course, its challenge has been the other way around, because what the Chinese Communist Party have done, they've used Hong Kong as a model, and so now you get lots of Hong Kong, and some of them a lot bigger, throughout China, such as Shanghai, and that is their challenge, that they are one of many in terms of their enterprise and that buzz that the place has, because you find it now in other Chinese cities, Shenzhen over the border, of course, in Guangzhou, the old Canton, and certainly in Shanghai, which is a far bigger city, biggest in the world. But so I do hope that the Chinese, the Hong Kong Chinese people, I mean, they can come out fighting and actually get what they want and retain as far as possible some form of democracy. But it's difficult to see how that's going to happen. Everybody was kung fu fighting. Those cats were fast as lightning. In fact, it was a little bit frightening. But they fought with expert timing. By the way, if you're a foodie, you won't find better restaurants anywhere in the world but Hong Kong.